Hello and welcome to our event and panel discussion, which is the first LGE 2021 event of the series. And today we will be discussing the local government's role in transitioning away from private car dependency. Thank you all for joining us today. My name is Tessel. I'm an urban and biophilic designer and also a board member of the Young Urbanists. We are a voluntary organization of multidisciplinary spatial practitioners interested in the development of our cities, which includes Cape Town and other South African cities. We are advocates for changing the entrenched apartheid spatial planning legacies to create more inclusive, sustainable, and happy city environments. So thank you all for being here with us virtually as we head into the LGE 2021 season. As an urbanized and continuously urbanizing country, it is critical our cities provide solutions to our urban problems. One of the many pressing issues facing our cities and Cape Town in general is the nature of our urban infrastructure, built to serve cars and not people, to segregate people rather than integrate city environments. This has direct ties to apartheid spatial planning and contemporary practices that, despite having plans to build more human-centric and inclusive cities, we are still reproducing urban sprawl, low density and car-oriented neighborhoods. So today we have 4 panelists to talk about how we as a metro, the city of Cape Town, can transition away from private car dependency. Something we feel is important not only because it is election season, but because it ties into many of our current urban problems, from the environment, health, the economy, and inequality. Before we introduce the panelists, we ask that for the duration of the panel discussion, everyone please keep their microphone on mute, but we encourage you to ask questions during the debate or to post comments and questions using the chat function. Please note that the meeting will be recorded and we will be posting it to our social media platforms. And if you wish to post on your own social media, we encourage you to use the hashtag YULGE2021, which I will be posting in the chats just to remind everyone. So without further ado, our first panelist is Jody. Jody is an independent city strategist who helps urban development policymakers, practitioners, advocacy workers, and civic groups improve their strategies, projects, know-how, and institutional systems for better, more resilient outcomes. Adi Kumar, our second panelist, is a land and housing activist. His global experiences focus on informal settlement upgrading, advocacy for land and housing rights, urban development, community organizing, and land value capture. Kirsten Wilkins is our third panelist, and she holds an undergraduate degree in architecture and a master's degree in city planning and urban design from the University of Cape Town. She has over 20 years of experience in shaping strategy and space in the city of Cape Town. At present, she is managing director of Open Streets Cape Town, an organization in its 9th year of promoting streets for people through car-free urban transformations. And then last but not least, Nobukosi Ngwenya is an urban planner and development practitioner currently working at African Center for Cities. Her current research examines the interface between citizen-led and state-led planning processes within Cape Town's human settlement sector. Nobu is currently completing her PhD at the UCT, which examines processes of land occupation. Those were our 4 wonderful and knowledgeable panelists, and I will continue by giving an outline of the event and then hand over to Roland. The city of Cape Town continually cites their desire for the devolution to the city of passenger rail and the transfer of control of certain key land parcels from the national government to create a more inclusive, car light, and just city. But is this the case? What more can the city of Cape Town do? While South Africa is exceptional in its history and how planning was weaponized during apartheid, the literature suggests similar projects from the 60s in the US, Australia, and UK took place, where highways and other public infrastructure were used as a means of segregating mostly lower income people of color from neighboring communities. In addition to these segregationist spatial planning policies in the South African context, the rise worldwide of private motor vehicle ownership and the widespread adoption of Euclidean zoning principles, segregating separating places of residence from places of commerce and leisure, and popularity of lower dense urban environments have resulted in sprawling cities. Since then, car dependency or urban sprawl has characterized most of the world and has negatively impacted our societies and exacerbated current social issues around climate change, inequality, biodiversity collapse, etc. And South Africa is no different. So as LGE 2021 is approaching, what is the role of the local government to reverse our segregated pattern of planning? Or more succinctly put, our dependency of private cars that perpetuates urban sprawl and apartheid spatial violence. In the absence of an effective metropolitan rail system, what can the city of Cape Town do to reverse apartheid spatial planning and transition away from private car dependency? The theme of this event is to see if the city of Cape Town is doing enough around land use and transport planning. So we would love to hear from you what can be done for the city of Cape Town and how we as a society can work together to navigate the realities of urban governance on a metro level. So please feel free to post any of your thoughts in our chat box, and we will do our best to respond throughout the event. And we hope to continue this discussion with a follow-up event. So I will now hand over to Roland, who will facilitate this discussion. And Roland is a steering committee member of the Young Urbanist and our lead for advocacy and projects. He is the co-founder of Planners Declare Australia and a full-time advocate, planner and researcher. Over to you, Roland.
Thanks, Tessa, for the beautiful introduction and outline. I just want to thank everyone for being here, and I just want to quickly remind panelists what's the aim of this event and also the kind of rules. Please try to keep your answers short and focus on the how of the problem. And then by the end of the discussion, we'll ask an action from each panelist on what we can do away from this discussion and how we can work with the city of Cape Town to assist in transitioning away from private car dependency that has been established as a root of a lot of societal problems. To build on that, for example, our dependency has meant streets are not safe for children or anyone for that matter. Cars not only produce greenhouse gases, but that actually affects our land users, which has a big impact on our water, climate, and biodiversity crisis, which deja vu to day zero, but also for transportation day zero, when there was no taxis in the city of Cape Town, which only happened a few weeks back. Economically, also, studies have shown that people that walk and cycle more spend more at local shops than through means of private car usage. Also, business owners in dense areas usually have the perception that people drive to their business when the opposites are actually true. So it's an economic argument to make, as well as social equitable. Now, before COVID and during COVID, cities like Bogota in the global south, Paris, Barcelona, London, Sydney, the list goes on, have used this chance to take away positive change in how we approach land use and transportation planning. So how can we raise the standard in South Africa and indeed the African continent? Urban sprawl and low density has direct tie to apartheid spatial violence. So how can we address this historical sin? So we need to talk about how we can change our infrastructure from being car-centric to be more caring, in other words, more walkable. So currently, to give everyone a bit of context, the city of Cape Town has only allocated 2% of its budget to non-motorized transportation in the next year financial budget. So what we can do as a metro or civil society to transition away from this car dependency? I guess my first question is going to go to Kirsten, because she is the director of Open Cities Cape Town and has worked a lot on this. So Kirsten, what can we do as a city to transition away from our private car dependency?
Okay, thanks, Roland, and hi to everyone who's in the room with us today and online watching this. I think it's great. Thanks for giving me a chance to kick off. Hopefully, I'll be able to create some hooks that other panelists can add to. I think what's very important for us at Open Streets, and I think something that many people who've been to an Open Streets Day would have had the experience of, rather than just sort of the idea of, is really the shift to understanding streets as public space. So when we talk about car dominance, car dependency, for me, I try and really kind of take a step back from that and saying, cars are only dominant in the space, and we're dependent on them because of the way that public space is managed and seen. So for me, to a large degree, the work that OpenStreets does is to help to positively shift people into the experience of streets as public space. And so our expectations of what streets can be, and the way that we can use streets, and the way that we can participate in the street, becomes a question of how do we participate in public space, rather than sort of the individual citizen versus the automotive industry, which I think it's a very despondent kind of discussion to have. So really it's about public space for us. But framed within that really is then, the public space question, it really becomes a land question. And that's where, for me, car dependency and car dominance move from what else could be doing in that space to streets and road spaces becoming very much a question that is political in nature, around justice, around equity, and not the apolitical technocratic spaces of car movement that we've been led to believe that they are. And so I think those are some of the discussions that I'd love to continue a little bit more on with the panelists, but I'll leave it there for now. Thanks, Roland.
You've touched on a lot of great things, but you did mention something that really I think we all want to talk about today is land. I know, because I know your research looks at informal areas, and usually we talk about transportation, we talk about the city ball, but obviously there's a much bigger city out there, a city of another tale. So how, from your research and your experience, from your view, can we talk about this, this dependency, this unhealthy dependency in informal areas, because they actually have the solution in terms of density and layouts, but how can we show the city that the solutions are in these areas, and also understand the needs of those areas and how they contribute to the city?
Yeah, thanks, Roland. I mean, the solutions are there. The tricky bit comes now because a vast majority of the formal economic opportunities are located, unfortunately, in the CBD, right? So even with that in mind, we do need to look at how in informal areas, and the informal areas are very good case studies in this regard, how the informal activities and some of the very formal activities have been kind of ingrained and made part and parcel of even informal areas in our townships, and how those are beginning to thrive, and everything is within walking distance. And I mean, we know the kind of the idea of the 15-minute city. 15-minute neighborhood and 15-minute city is kind of the talk of the day at the moment, but we've got something similar happening in informal settlements. So I think it's time that we actually begin recognizing that and learning from what's happening in informal settlements, and kind of replicating that and scaling that in other parts of the city. So instead of looking at informal settlements as the other, we should actually be looking at our much lower density suburbs and neighborhoods as the other, and kind of focusing primarily and shifting our attention to informal settlements.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point. It's all about perception and utilizing what we have and learning from that and building on that. It's not one versus the other. Both can assist, both informal and formal. And I know, Adi, you have done a lot of work with DACH, the Development Action Group, around lands, especially in housing. From your perspective, how yes, we have this informal versus formal economy, and how we can use both economies and typologies, but how can we integrate this with land? Because we know land use planning, housing and transport need to go hand in hand, despite despite there's a lot of transportation corridors next to key rail lines, but we don't have that access as a city. So how else can we navigate these issues?
Thanks, Roland. So I think, yeah, you're absolutely right. And Kirsten and Nobu as well, in terms of there's a direct relationship between car dependency and urban sprawl and land use management. There's no denying that. The issue has been then the development trajectory, particularly around housing, has been to build along the periphery. So if you look at some of the historical facts, since 1977 to 2006, Cape Town has doubled in size. Its urban area has doubled in size, obviously related to in-migration, urbanization, and all of those issues, partially during apartheid, partially post-apartheid. So a city that grows at that dramatic a rate, like going up to 40–50% or doubling in its size in a matter of 25 years, is a very significant issue. The other piece is that there was a development edge that the city had put in place since 1996, which was around putting a periphery around where urban development would take place. Now, back in 2013, there was a big debate around the Philippi horticultural area where the urban edge came into real question. And that time, the mayor directly said that the urban edge is an artificial barrier that assists the city with planning, which can be moved and removed as needed, as required, which was a bizarre kind of recommendation. And since 2017, we haven't had an urban edge, as a direct kind of framework or a policy guidance in the city, which has a direct impact on how sprawl happens. It just means that we can absorb every year, thousands of hectares of land into the urban area, which might be underdeveloped, underutilized, could be for biodiversity, but then comes into play, particularly around land use development and planning and so on. So yeah, so definitely there's a very significant connection there between how some of these things take place. And then in terms of kind of local authority, obviously SPLUMA, which is the Spatial Management and Land Use Management Act, gave the authority to local municipality to intervene in this level of planning, which we can talk about later. But I think that's quite an important development that is taking place in the last decade or so.
Yeah.
Thanks.
No, great. So just to quickly summarize, Kirsten talks about how he perceives space in terms of streets. So streets are for other users other than cars. And because he talked about the kind of the answers of the informal economy, we don't actually have to look at Paris, we can actually look quite, next door. And then Adi talked about kind of urban sprawl and how, we haven't curtailed urban sprawl and, how we can integrate land use planning. So I guess my next question to Jody is, in terms of urban governance, how can we change urban governance? Is it administrative in terms of to kind of, if you look at the 3 points that we just raised, how can we in urban governance address those issues? Have we done this in the past? Are we doing it? Are there any plans? What's your view?
Thanks, Roland. So firstly, I just want to distinguish between different types of car users. I'll get to your question now. I think I agreed with Nobu, firstly, on the 15-minute city being most sort of realized in our informal settlements. And where low-income people are car users, it's primarily for them seeking access to more formalized work opportunities or seeking safety. Where it's not safe to use non-motorized transport, then they might use a mapela or things like that to sort of get around. And you may find sort of one household having an old car, but it's shared between sort of many extended family members and only used on the weekend and things like that. So I would say we don't need to sort of worry too much about car use in that segment of society, other than to maybe address safety concerns so that we can have more sort of walkability. There's a middle income group who are not using public transport and not walking, primarily because of where they live and what those neighborhoods look like and how difficult it is to get around, and also because of the lack of reliable public transport, not fancy public transport, just reliable public transport. The middle class would shift to reliable public transport if it was reliable, because it would be a significant enough financial impact on a middle class household to do that. But it's primarily because of where they live and the lack of public transport. And those two conversations have to happen together. You can't just shift where they live and not also shift the walkability or the access to public transport. And then there's the wealthy, who are mainly living in kind of very leafy, hard to access suburbs or gated estates on the urban edge, and increasingly even outside of the metro and that sort of thing. They don't use public transport unless they're overseas. And so the kind of solution there is either addressing the where they live, the gated estates, really kind of curbing that, or more through the sort of future of work kind of conversations and that sort of thing. I don't see this sort of sophisticated understanding of the different components of who are users of private vehicles, where they live, why they're using. It's generally one size fits all campaigns on behavior change. And in my opinion, to go to your question around governance, plans like SDFs and district plans and things like that, but not followed through by real interventionist applications to actually intervene in the urban land market, to intervene in the transport system, to really sort of direct the market. Most of our infrastructure spend, most of our development activity is not interventionist. It's triggered by what the market does, and we follow where the market goes. So we plan on the one hand, but then we don't actually intervene in accordance with that plan. We are triggered by development application and follow where it goes.
So it seems there's a trend of, we have these plans that talk about more compact, inclusive, just cities, but when it comes to implementation, it's a big issue. You know, and this question is open to all the panelists, and any comments from the attendees, please put them in the comment section. How can we change that? So, you know, I think it's about getting the basics right. Regardless of what the plans are, we need to implement them. And we need to understand, and I guess work with all other sectors, whether it's the market, civil society, probably not going to mention other spheres of government, but I guess in this instance, how can we start as a metro implementing these plans we have? Open to anyone.
I'll give it a shot. Okay, so something that I see quite a bit is that I think that there's a sort of real disparity between, at local government level particularly, between plans and municipally required ways of structuring budgets and structuring, you know, land use spatial planning, and a vision. And I sort of, because my world is more in the sort of spatial planning side of things, I can sort of try and make out a vision that a city or an administration might be trying to lead towards, with these sort of disparate pieces of sort of policy and these like really great buzzwords, and oh, that's what they're looking to do. But for me, the real opportunity here in terms of local government elections is for political leadership to move us away from simply ticking boxes around kind of spatial planning mechanisms, which are very hard to engage with, and actually bringing people along with a vision for transport in our city. And I think that for me is really critical, because we go from the bare minimum, or, you know, trying to keep everyone happy, to actually engaging with people in terms of how they want to contribute to the city, and how they want to spend their money, and whether they dream of living, and really kind of like engaging that sort of like positive sort of part of being a Cape Townian. I feel like there's a really big kind of chasm there, and I do think that it will be the role of incoming political leadership to move us away from, hopefully that plan works, to actually what's the vision and how do we get more people involved. Because I think the city administration sort of trying to grind it out as best they can and hoping, you know, the public at large kind of gets it. It's just really, it's not workable, and it feels very incremental, to be honest. So I would really be pushing for a vision that allows every single person to make a better choice about how they move, where they live, how they get involved in politics. And again, I mean, just to sort of come back to my initial comment, I think a lot of transport needs to get out of that technocratic space and start serving people, being for people, and engaging with people in the language and way in which people generally can understand, rather than being relatively kind of siloed. So yeah, that's my best shot at that answer. Thanks, Roland.
It's a very hard question. Obviously, we had the Transportation Development Authority that combined development and transportation. You know, so is that something we see coming up in the next elections, or a likelihood? Or, you know, I mean, obviously, I ask initial questions. So if you guys have any other answers to that, please do. But I'm just kind of putting down my thoughts here. But I'm keen to hear from you guys around this kind of disparity between plans and implementation. No,
Yeah.
No, I mean,
no,
okay,
go
ahead, Jody. Okay. I think there is, I mean, to agree with Kirsten, there is definitely a disparity between kind of the plans and the implementation. And for me, it really also does kind of boil down to this very technical and very technocratic understanding of what the issues are within the city. I think what's also, in addition to getting more people involved and kind of carving out that space for private citizens, particularly, to also get involved in making some of these bigger decisions and shaping the vision, we also need to understand that people are very nuanced beings. So we tend to just whittle it down to numbers. Okay, we have this many cars going down the road at this point, going down the N1 between 8 a.m. and 9 a.m. What do we do about that? But we need to understand like the entire journey. Where are people coming from? Where are people going? What happens in between? When they get to the destination, where do they go from there? And really begin to kind of see people and understand their choices in a very kind of multi-dimensional manner. And that will also help us to begin really addressing kind of and helping people to make better choices and shifting away from cars. But it also helps the city to provide more suitable solutions to the challenges that we're currently facing around transport and the reliance of the private car.
So I guess there's something to learn from the 50-minute city or the 20-minute or the 1-minute city or Bogota, because it actually communicates a vision and the options. And if we look at the draft of the Comprehensive Integration Transportation Plan, it's a very boring document that even I struggle to comprehend and understand, to navigate. But I know, Jody, you wanted to say something. So Jody, over to you.
Yeah, I mean, I like what's just been said in terms of engaging with the user. I think we can be at risk of importing ideas around modeling and making assumptions around how people will make choice. Kirsten used the word choice. And we could make assumptions around how people will make choice about where they live and where they work and what mode of transport they use. And again, a certain class of people have that luxury of being able to make choice. But in our economic context and our economic context first and foremost, but layered on top of that also our context of crime and safety and those sorts of things, people's framework for making choice and framework of choice is fundamentally different. And we have to have process for empathizing with users and really understanding what informs their choice, what range of choice, first of all, do they really have? And secondly, what would inform choice if they had a wider range of choice to make? And it might surprise us what the answers to those questions are. We have to be cautious of kind of going with too technical a process or importing ideas from elsewhere to answer those questions, because our unemployment rate, our economic modes, and our sort of safety considerations are so fundamentally different to any other context. And then, yeah, on the sort of administrative side, I was personally very excited by the idea of bringing together transport and planning together. I do think that those things need to speak to each other in terms of really addressing this question and fundamentally other questions of how we restructure our city. But I think that's sort of necessary but not sufficient to the problem that I raised of becoming interventionist. I think that could improve planning, but it might not necessarily actually create an interventionist state. You could still have a situation where you have improved planning, but the actual budgets for infrastructure and investment in the city or directing of where private developments are approved or where the city allocates its infrastructure budget could still be informed by other triggers, political triggers or triggers led by the market. Cautious that it's necessary, but potentially not sufficient.
So would you then say we need something that's independent, that's TIEF, that's bounded by evidence-based planning, or or perhaps, participation, if we have greater participation. I think another great question from the audience is, Michaela said, do the panelists have any ideas on how we can make public participation more accessible and more meaningful? I think we have three components here: having a vision, obviously not imported from abroad, understanding because of our history, our local governments, the complexities as both Jody and Nubu raised, but also then the administrative side of things. How can we, increase participation? But Adi, I realized we haven't given you any more airtime. If you want to answer the initial question, or do you want to contribute to both questions, but I'm just going to leave it to you now.
Just enjoying listening to the other three. So
me too.
I just wanted to say, I mean, it's not just in Cape Town. I think there's an institutional paralysis at the moment around translating kind of simple ideas. I mean, most local governments across the country, if you look at the Auditor General's report, are failing in their basic mandate of service delivery. So it's unsurprising that City of Cape Town is unable to translate some of the kind of broad SDF, IDP type of ideas into practice. Partially, I would say that it has to do with the internal culture of how local government is managed with this fear and apathy and real consequence management of taking any decisions. And it's partially driven by the upper and middle class around lawsuits, taking place, or, court action taking place on developments taking place in Camps Bay and things like that. As a result, just making simple procurement decisions and so on has become so centralized in terms of the political mandate rather than the administrative mandate that has become quite a big challenge. What can be done? So firstly, I agree with Jody on the idea that like the TDA was the transport and planning function together was a super kind of move in terms of consolidating. And I don't think it's an independent body. It's a body that's situated at the heart of kind of public service at local government and does that thing. I think there's some work that needs to be done around conceptualizing and actually doing some work around understanding and describing land, not as a balance sheet asset, but much more for debt and for all of those things, but much more has to be defined in a local government space. It's constitutionally defined. It's defined in various pieces of legislation, but its interpretation at the local government level, particularly in the City of Cape Town, is quite narrow. So I think there's a expansion that needs to be done there. And then definitely there isn't a space in the city at the moment which looks at kind of consolidation of land assembly. And this is sadly, Kirsten is going to hate me for this, but it does require some high degree of technical work to consolidate land, to plan it, to zone it appropriately. I mean, look at Belleville. I mean, it's upzoned for the last 5 years, and really very few developers are taking up the density that's available there to develop. And there's a reason for it, even though the transport infrastructure is there. So I think there is a need for some kind of understanding when the city does offer, density in particular areas next to transport nodes, why that density isn't taken up, and where is the land needing to be consolidated, where it needs to be assembled for development. Thanks.
No, thank you. I mean, I think we're all kind of on the same page in terms of what needs to be done, and we're receiving a lot of great comments and questions from the panelists. But before I'm kind of delve into what's been commenting, is there anything that you guys want to say that's pertinent to this discussion? I mean, obviously, we can talk about this hours and hours, but what are the kind of key lighthouse ideas you guys want to see change? Assuming we get a elite or political party, because we don't vote for MA, we vote for political party, right? In terms of implementing these ideas, despite their inherent complexities and sensitivities as well.
Yeah, Roland, I'll just jump in there if you don't mind, only because then I can just encourage Adi, that technocrats are also my friends. Now, you know what? If I look at the zoning map for the City of Cape Town, it really paints a different picture of what is possible with the land held by the Transport Directorate, or in the care of the Transport Directorate. Because when I look at that zoning map, I just see swathes of land in every neighborhood. And if we looked at land parcels that Transport holds, I wouldn't even go so far as to have the how much space for a car, how much space for bicycle discussion. Let's kind of even just park that for a bit. What is interesting for me and where I think local government should jump is to do an audit and process in which they really reassess the sterile land that is kept vacant for as road reserves. For me, there's so much potential in this sort of massive land that would possibly, be available for some kind of congestion relief in the future. If we know that the future of our city is not more space for cars, I really feel like doing some kind of getting some kind of understanding of what that means, and getting on top of the opportunities, particularly in the informal sector, for using land that is currently sort of set aside for road reserves, I think could really shift the way that we see what a transport journey is, because it's sort of peppered with all kinds of amazing opportunities that would make the distance of travel a completely different experience. But I also think the value of that land can be used immediately, and I think it's something that we really need to look at and just be quite creative about. So I just wanted to sort of throw that out there, because I really feel that whether it's either ecological value or economic value, we really do have a lot of land that we need to assess the value of, not only transport but also for housing. But I think the value of public land is really the question for local government as soon as a bum sits on a chair after elections, quite frankly.
Now, I'm going to have to go into this. There's obviously been a big debate between land that's owned by the national government, and obviously there's also land owned by the provincial and local government. So, do we see the city actually utilizing land that's owned by the city for these investments around pertaining to it's to transport, housing, and other values? Look at Battery Park in the City Bowl, the mixed use, that mixed use area, and how that has transformed that area. Do we see that part of the solution as well, where land that's owned by the city to drive up these investments, whether it's an audit, but then having a plan that actually delivers these outcomes on land that's owned by the city?
I don't mind having a go at that. Yeah, I mean, for me, the debate, it's obviously become hugely political. Just before I joined, I saw that there was a press release. Steenhuisen has said that they must use golf courses, and literally like 2 months ago, there was a press release from the city saying they're not going to use Rondebosch golf course, and he said they must do so. I mean, it's just a football everywhere. So clearly there needs to be a process that actually provides clarity on that question. And I think there's been a lot of attention on specific land parcels in the CBD and on golf courses and things like that. But the city owns huge amounts of land all over the city. And I've been working in Durban recently, and I've been blown away by what I'm seeing in Durban. They have a social housing pipeline of 147 sites. 147, we're talking about 11 in Woodstock. They've got a pipeline, and they've got a social housing department of 2 people, also low capacity. Those poor 2 people are like, also tearing their hair out and so burnt out. And, I just want to like double quadruple their capacity and give them a hug every time I see them and everything. But 147 sites in their pipeline, located all across the metro, in well-established nodes, in new nodes, in townships, in the CBD, everywhere. They're doing at train stations developments with PRASA, with private retail and commercial developers, doing retail and offices, with Culgro doing gap rent to buy apartments, with a social housing company doing a social housing development. And they're doing that in former township areas as much as they're doing it in former suburban areas, as much as they're doing it in the sort of equivalent of the Mitchell's Plains and things like that. It's unbelievable, and it's not hypothetical. I went there like 2 weeks ago, and there are thousands of people on site building, digging, things like that. So I think when we talk about Cape Town, we must get serious about scale and pace. It's not 11 sites in Woodstock, it's 100 sites across the whole city that we need to be talking about. And that's real spatial transformation. It's changing the township as much as it is changing Cape Town CBD.
Yeah, I think that brings back to Nobu's points about, learning from our informal areas. And I think there's a question from Mohammed talking about, perhaps suggesting we have a 1 hour metropole that's more apt for Cape Town. Do we see an opportunity where we, take the opportunities what we've learned from these informal areas to kind of map out the vision of, looking at other case studies like in Durban, or whether it's in Gauteng, or across the continent for that matter, Angola, Lagos, the list goes on and on. Do we, then, this kind of vision of what it means to build, decolonization of the city and, a contemporary context, can we learn from these areas and then bring these kind of informal areas together through the right leadership on a metro level?
Yeah, I think we absolutely can learn from different areas, and not just in informal areas in Cape Town, but also places like Durban. And I think it's absolutely fantastic that all the progress that's happening in Durban. So, and I mean, to me, it shows that where there is a will, there is certainly a way. And what we also need in the Cape Town context is the will to actually not only learn, but to actually implement. I think we also do tend to get caught up in conversations around the vision and what it is that we want to see, and that kind of and can really get stuck at that level instead of actually just doing what needs to be done, right? And we've been talking for a while. Let's continue the conversation, but as the conversation is going on, there are opportunities for us to intervene and start improving lives and start improving the way our city currently functions.
So despite the complexities, we need to be more pragmatic and start doing. Obviously, we mentioned that through COVID, there was an opportunity to build towards the new normal for lots of city planners and practitioners across the world. Barcelona really accelerating their process of building more people, climate, blocks, neighborhood blocks. Has Cape Town missed that opportunity? Do we still have that opportunity where we can use the local government elections to, be a catalyst for this change we need that we saw in all these other cities with also the same kind of urbanness, but of course not the same history or complexities as ours? Do we still that opportunity exist now in running up to the local government elections? Anyone? And this is also a question from Alazai, if I pronounce your name right, apologies. COVID has brought an opportunity. What are the long-term effects if we miss this opportunity to change our urban fabric?
So maybe just from my side, so I completely agree with kind of all the other speakers, esteemed speakers, about affordable housing, social housing in well-located areas, and the city does control a lot of land. I mean, it's also a question of scale here. I mean, all the new build in Cape Town only contributes perhaps 1% of what the existing building stock is. And I think that the person who raised the question of COVID's new reality, I mean, the vacancy rate of office buildings in the CBD is really high. I mean, if I had to take anything to the election campaign and to the politicians, I would say, offer some incentives to retrofit these buildings for housing, because the cost of building new infrastructure, putting together new buildings and all of those kind of things, far outstrips utilizing and retrofitting existing buildings. So I think there is a real opportunity there for either political party to leverage that in the context of COVID. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely retrofitting. There's so much unused space. We won't talk about parking, and across me there's a building that was retrofit for a parking lot, and this is across the city. So imagine what we could do. But with the new normal that's happening, how can kind of building on what Adi just said, how can we use these elections to catalyze the city of Cape Town to build towards a new normal of in conscience of our own complexities? So what do you guys think on the opportunities or the possibilities of this?
There's some interesting young people, at least one of which is on this this call. So there's there's some reasons to be cautiously optimistic around some new blood and things like that coming in, and I think a lot of credit has to go also to activists, people like Addy, but other organizations who really sort of gotten these issues on the agenda over the last few years, to the point that this is now a major election campaigning issue. And as a result of that, promises and commitments are being made. Those of us who've been around for a while are jaded and tired of hearing promises, but when promises are made in public forums, that's something for you to sort of hold on to, and immediately sort of go into the first year, and as the IDP is being written, actually say, well, where does this appear in the IDP as the SDF is rewritten, as the ITPN is rewritten, for us to say, okay, but these promises were made in the election campaign, where are they now in these documents? Where are they in the budgets that get approved, and that sort of thing? And I think that's our responsibility, is to be diligent and awake as all of those documents go out to public process, not just vote come election day and then and say, oh well, they made those promises, I've cast my vote and now I'm happy, but actually make sure that those promises are institutionalized through those mechanisms.
I couldn't agree more. Accountability. So I guess that's probably I was thinking a different question to this, and how we can work as civil society or academia or even the private sector to hold people in power accountable, regardless of who wins the local government elections, because these plans have been made, these promises have been made. We, like, what Nubu said, we know what the problems are. We have done the plans, we've done the work. And I think I've had a similar conversation with Adi about this. How can we actually start doing, despite, participatory, understanding, having low capacity in local government that Jody kind of illustrated, or even public perception towards these solutions when it comes to parking and space in our roads. How can we start doing and less talking, I guess? Sorry, it's hard. It's a big question. Sorry.
Yeah, it's a very big question. But I mean, in terms of just starting with the question of holding government to account, I think it is exactly as Jody said, we shouldn't just vote and then leave it at that. For a lot of us on the call, we are familiar with these documents. We do engage with them quite often throughout the course of our work. But it is also to go back and I don't know how we develop, whether we develop programs or our civil society partners develop programs to familiarize the ordinary person on the street about these different documents and how these documents actually dictate where resources go, and how that in turn affects whether or not the infrastructure that they require in their neighborhood gets built or doesn't. Right, and then helping kind of and helping the ordinary person in the street to apply pressure through the ward structures as well, not just in terms of us going once in a while to picket in front of the civic center, but that daily pressure on ward councillors to also be accountable, because somewhere, somehow, especially in a lot of our townships, the ward councillor can disappear for 5 years or for 2 years and only come back around election time. And people are like, but wait, you're still around? You're still our ward councillor? Like, we haven't even heard anything from you. So it's also then to get those kind of those mechanisms of representation that have been put in place through the Constitution and various other legal mechanisms and pieces of legislation, and get those to work as well at the very, very basic ground level, the grassroots level. And so that there is that constant questioning of why are you not delivering? Why is this not part of that kind of the SDF? Why is that not part of the SDF? Or why is this not part of the ITDP? Where's the budget? And all of that daily. And not only when we're like, oh, but we've been waiting. Why haven't you done this?
Yeah. I mean, I can speak from, I completely agree. I can speak for myself. I have my ward councillor on my WhatsApp and I bombard him with stuff and he answers. So I guess my question is, obviously not everyone is like us, more engaged and understand these documents and what has been done in the past. But I guess my question now is, looking at you, Adi and Kirsten, how can we as civil society work together so that we can put more pressure, empower ordinary citizens, empower other organizations, because, you know, in the comments, we did talk about a siloed approach in government, but perhaps there's also a siloed approach in civil society. And we actually have a lot in comments, and we need to look at the holistic when it comes to urban planning.
Yeah, Adi, you happy if I respond first? Okay, so I'm wondering if I should make an example. I won't, of a local councillor, but in the last 2 or 3 months, I had a wonderful experience with somebody who's a local councillor who actually gave feedback from one of these subcommittee meetings. So it's sort of, I mean, typically it's a sort of 4 to 5 hour meeting, deals with like massively technical stuff, some of which I care about, some of which like doesn't really affect me. But his feedback to his constituency was, hey, I was in the session representing you. This is what they spoke about. This is how I responded. Let me know what you think. Sort of like you know, watch the video at your own kind of leisure. I just felt like so engaged. I felt like I could contribute because I was, the councillor was holding himself accountable in the way that he translated the work and the way that he asked for opinions. You know, there was a real kind of give and take there, and I really enjoyed that. And I think everybody voting in this local election for me should hold their ward councillor to account for the decisions that that person is making on your behalf. I counted how many sessions my ward councillor has been in, you know, taking my voice if he'd asked, and frankly, he never did. Anyway. It is almost 1,000 meetings that this man has been in, having an opinion on my behalf about how the city should be. And I don't think that's good enough. I think a ward councillor is elected by you to be your voice in those rooms, so that that room isn't filled with, you know, 5.5 million people and it's just, you know, 10 or 12. And I really, really think that feedback loop is going to be super important, because then you can say to your ward councillor, you can have that conversation. You can say, so, you know, why did you sit there quietly when they passed the streets and public nuisance bylaw that criminalizes homelessness? You know, you can have that conversation, because that person is representing you. If that person doesn't put their hand up and object, you didn't object. So I think that closing that ward council loop is probably the most important thing that we can do to be active citizens generally. It'll impact transport, it'll impact housing, it'll impact things like whether or not your trash gets picked up. All of your life is funneled through this one person into the machine, and you really need to pick that person carefully and make sure that that communication loop is there. So yeah, I think that's, and I mean, I don't think it's any different to how it's ever been, but I think more and more we're realizing how important that is. And actually this term of office is not going to be one where a ward council will have the luxury of disappearing, I think.
Indeed. No, thank you for that. So I completely agree. It's all about that continual discussion. And just want to remind everyone that it's almost 2 o'clock. So any more questions, please put them down. But Adi, I know you wanted to say something about that.
I think partly, Roland, what has happened in civil society is that a lot of the advocacy over the years has become very state-centered. If you look back at civil society almost a decade ago, a lot of the civil society's orientation was much more geared towards building capacity of people to understand what's going on. And that became an exhausting process. It was a natural transition, but people are just exhausted by the number of kind of things they need to know, number of legislation they need to be aware of, whether it comes to informal settlement upgrading or any other kind of issue that we've been contending with. I mean, you look at some of the recent cases going on, whether on, you know, on the Lisbeck or engaging any kind of other larger developments and so on. Each civic association needs to familiarize themselves with NEMA, with SPLUMA, with planning bylaws. It's an extensive amount of work that, you know, anybody in civil society needs to do. So I guess the one, I couldn't agree with you more. So a much more coherent and consolidated civil society would be absolutely brilliant. And I think there is some movement in Cape Town around getting a lot of the civil society organizations to pull in the same direction. I think from my perspective, I think advocacy definitely has to have 2 components. One has to be very state-focused and state-centered around accountability, but it has to build kind of capacity and capability of, you know, citizens to be able to carry some of these functions. I think the most successful processes that I've been involved in personally have been one where government officials and ward councillors have said, actually, we don't know how to deal with this complex problem. Those have been the most honest and the most kind of ones with most integrity, where you can build a relationship with people who are ready to admit that they don't understand how to solve the problems that we face with in Cape Town. So I think that would be a good starting point for me, is getting politicians and civil societies to actually say, and ward councillors and the whole kind of shebang, to actually admit that we don't have the answers to these things, but in conversation is where we need to come up with, and not in the kind of more formal structures, but much in a more kind of genuine way, I would say.
No, great answer, Adi. It's both individual and also collectively. You know, we need different approaches with the same kind of goal of creating a more inclusive, caring city that addresses apartheid, but also carves out a contemporary city going forward, considering, you know, what's been happening with COVID and so forth. But we also have other issues, you know, whether it's hunger, inequality. So there's a lot of issues. It's not just climate change. But in terms of that question, I would like to give Jody and Nubu an answer to answer those questions, because I think your perspectives can really add some value to that. How we can work as civil society, you know, do we focus collectively or do we focus on the citizens? You know, because we are in a democratic, despite voting for political parties and not mayors per se.
Yeah. So I really like that you sort of provoked around silos in civil society. I do think that there sometimes are silos, and I think it's okay for there to be different tactics, and I think different tactics work in a complementary fashion for each other, and sometimes people are offended by different organizations taking a different approach on the same issue, where we should be welcoming of different tactics that are sometimes raising the heat and sometimes working more in partnership with the city, and that's okay. They're all playing their role in terms of driving change. But we should sort of respect the role of different organizations in that regard. And I also think different ways of engagement will attract different members of society. This is something that I've also learned in my capacity with OBSID, is that some members want to get involved in like neighborhood watch type of activities, and other people couldn't be less interested in that sort of thing, but really want to come to a gardening day. And you know, somebody wants to come and paint the subway, and somebody else is not interested in getting their hands dirty painting a subway, but does want to come to a community meeting and kind of share what's on their heart or whatever. So you have to have a diversity of platforms, and you have to have a diversity of activities and engagement methods and things like that. And I think that, you know, we all need to kind of speak to our strengths in that regard. And the more we have, the better in that way. I'm quite, I don't know, yeah, at the moment I'm feeling like civil society has taken a downward turn and is dying. And I don't know if it's COVID. I feel like it was a trend before COVID, that too many efforts and initiatives were squashed and killed and kind of seen as politically threatening instead of seen as active citizenry that should have been welcomed. And we need to sort of reignite that. And I'm hoping that any sort of incoming political setup might be more welcoming of active citizenry and not force us to become activists as a result of how we're treated. And through that create a greater diversity of ways in which people can express their active citizenry, whether it's putting on street events like Open Streets Days, or whether it's holding sessions around what's in front of council because somebody actually wants to engage technically. You know, people should be welcome to do whatever that range of things is that speaks to their interests and their strength.
So what I'm picking up here is really about the culture of the city of Cape Town as a metro, but also its capacity as well, and also having the right leadership as well, and also perhaps the right mechanisms when it comes to participation, something I think that can be improved in a lot when it comes to any form of plan, and then also implementation that we kind of talked about. and not being seen as some political intervention, but it is, you know, it's an administrative reform like we saw with TDA. So before we kind of move on, because it is almost 2 o'clock and this conversation has been quite fascinating, and I really appreciate all the comments and input from all 4 panelists, and also Tesla as well, and everyone at Young Urbanists. But is there anything that you guys want to quickly say before I ask each action, or I know someone's going to say 2 actions and you're allowed to say more than 2, that, you know, you think we can take to Jordan, one of the mayor candidates for the city of Cape Town, when we do meet with him next week? You know, is there anything that you guys quickly want to say, or please, now's the time. I take that as a no. I know it's a beautiful day. I think we should end the call soon and go out and enjoy the sun. But, you know, from this talk, it seems we have a lot of common in terms of agreement of what needs to be done from both from society, civil society, as citizens, but also as a metro. And I think, you know, if all those things can come together, then, you know, I understand a lot of people are jaded, and because you guys have been here advocating, you know, on the grassroots for a very long time, and people like myself and Tessa are quite new to this space, but it's quite inspiring to see you guys, you know, whether it's research, whether it's practice, whether it's advocating, that, you know, despite all the promises, all the broken promises, that we are persisting, and we know what the solutions are. It's just about doing. And that's quite hard, because you need resources and you need the right political leadership to support that, and you need a more caring city. So because of this, and I really appreciate everyone, I just want to, oh, sorry, Kirsten?
Yeah, I'm going to drop one idea, only because it's something that I've been doing the last week and a bit with you know, wannabe mayors or politicians or whatever. I feel 100% that we need to do less convincing as activists or activist citizens when the people who are making the decisions about our city are not behind a desk. Every aha moment, every I don't even have to explain anything, is when I've had the opportunity to have that conversation, those interactions, not in a boardroom, but, you know, on that piece of infrastructure, or we go walk down the train line and you meet someone and you see the life that someone's living, and the city tells its own story. And so for me, if you were to ask Jordan or Brett or whichever wonderful person is going to be the mayor, I would say, please change the culture of the city of Cape Town so that both politicians and administrators have a chance to leave the desks and go and listen to the city. That would just, all good things will start when people can realize themselves what it is that the work that they're doing, and meet the people who they're doing work for. So I'm just going to leave that as my hope. So that's everyone, that's officials, that's if you're making decisions about policy, the most dangerous thing is to be at a desk. So mic drop, I'm done, thanks.
Perfect. So that's your action, Kirsten. Thank you so much. I think we all can agree to that action. Who wants to be next in terms of action? I'm going to go to you, Nobu.
Okay, I think for me, it'd be for the city to put in place mechanisms so that the average working class person can begin to improve, or rather continue and build on the work that they've done so far to improve their lives. And just to give a quick example, we've seen a lot of instances where so folks have put up backyard dwellings, second or third dwellings in their backyards in different townships, and then kind of city folks come in and say, no, but you didn't get planning permission, and get people to demolish. Let's work with folks on the ground and build on that momentum and that capacity, and help them regularize where decentralization needs to happen, and just give people that space and that leeway to also contribute to solving some of these challenges we're facing.
I think someone in the comments, Rory, said that the regulations haven't caught up, and especially in the informal economy. And that's a big issue. They're not the enemy. These people want to build more caring, inclusive cities, and we need to empower them and support them and give them the resources as well. That kind of, informal versus formal, completely agree. I think that's a great action. Jody, you're next. Thank you, Nobu.
Yeah, I love what's been said already. I love questions, especially those who know me know that I always want to do site visits and drag officials out from behind their desks to do site visits, because the experience kind of just shifts everything. So I would almost want to make it a rule that officials have to spend at least one day a week out of their office in the communities that they serve. If they could make that some kind of rule, I'd be very happy with that. It links to what's just been discussed around the regulations not keeping up and that sort of thing. And I think it speaks both to the public transport aspect of this discussion, as well as the land use aspect of this discussion, and in fact the whole modality of what local government is the city of Cape Town and cities in general in South Africa are holding on to this idea that they have to be the kind of sole provider of all of the solutions and all of the mechanisms and all of that. And actually in the transport space, they are the tiniest fraction of the provider of mobility services, and they're the tiniest fraction of the provider of housing. And yet they have a very poor, sophisticated understanding of what is their regulatory function and what is their enabling function. So they focus so much on their delivery function, which they do poorly, and have hardly any capacity dedicated to their regulatory function and their enabling function. So actually they need to invest, that is where they can make the biggest difference, and they need to invest hugely in their capacity around modernizing their regulatory function and enabling function. And we could spend a lot of time on what that means, but I think we've run out of time. But yeah.
No, that's very apt. We need a capable and the right capacity with the right people in local government. Without that, as much what plan we have, we can't implement it. But obviously we need the political leadership to follow, but we need a civil society, a public civil society that's ready and armed and resourced. Thanks, Jody. Adi, what's your action?
All of the above. So I think I've already said some of them. I think the issue of land, placing land as a kind of almost a priority, but also defined much more clearly from a political and administrative perspective. I think definitely something around an institutional coherence around land planning, transport would be superlatively useful, where land is kind of the binding factor between planning and transport would be a really useful intervention. And then I think with the inner city, I think somebody's already asked, I do think that there's an opportunity with the vacancy rates. I think that could be something that any new leadership in the city could really leverage, provided with a set of incentives, could really spurn the private sector to come into play to build the more compact version of the city. Yeah, that's it from my side. Thanks, Roland.
Thank you. It's all about a mixed use approaches and utilizing what we have. I think that's it, and I think it's been more than an hour. I'm going to leave it there. This session is being recorded, so we are going to release a lot. There's a lot that's going to come from this session, so it's not just a siloed session. It's going to build onto something else. These actions are going to be presented to Jordan. I just want to take the opportunity to thank all the attendees, the panelists, Tessel, Young Urbanists, for being here and, engaging on these issues despite them being an issue, a long time ago. We are in 2021. The world is changing, but the issues remain the same. But the solutions, we know what they are. It's just a matter about implementation and getting collectivism and understanding that we have differences and that there's no right or wrong solution. It's all about democracy and the beauty that it brings when it comes to urban governance and urban society. I want to thank everyone. I'm going to stay around if anyone wants to say anything or ask anything. I hope I got to all the questions and comments in the section. If I didn't, I do apologize. We're going to respond to all the questions on social media, so please, we haven't ignored you. But thank you, everyone. Thank you, Tessel. And I hope you guys have a beautiful, is it Wednesday? Yeah, have a beautiful Wednesday. And I'm excited for what's going to come next, despite it being election season.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.
Thanks, Tessa.
Roland.
Bye.
Thanks, Tessa.
Bye.
Thanks, Tessel. Thanks, Roland.
Thank you, everyone.